The lights were blinding. Cameras clicking. A fairy tale frozen in time. But here's the question no one dared ask back then. What if the romance everyone celebrated was never the real story? Because sometimes, the loudest truths are whispered years later, by the people who stood closest, saw the cracks early, and stayed silent until silence became impossible. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine being inside the room before the world fell in love. Before the dress. Before the carriage. Before the headlines told you this was destiny. Now imagine hearing something said so casually, so confidently, that it didn't sound like love at all. It sounded like a plan. And that's where this story begins. For years, the narrative was airtight. A modern love story. A prince breaking tradition. A woman stepping into history. And anyone who questioned it was labeled bitter, jealous, or cruel. But behind closed doors, among friends who knew the unfiltered version, a very different conversation was unfolding. Why did certain comments feel rehearsed? Why did ambition always seem to arrive before affection? And why did the people who helped the most quietly disappear once the spotlight was secured? This isn't about tearing down a relationship. It's about understanding it. Because when someone who once defended the story at all costs finally speaks, it forces a reckoning. Not with gossip, with patterns, with timing, with contradictions that were always there, hiding in plain sight. The silence lasted years. Not because there was nothing to say, but because saying it came with consequences. Loyalty was weaponized. Privacy was sacred. And crossing that invisible line meant exile from a very powerful narrative. But something shifted. Call it disillusionment. Call it betrayal. Call it the moment when watching history being rewritten became unbearable. Whatever the reason, the dam finally cracked. And when it did, it revealed a version of events that reframes everything we thought we understood. Ask yourself this. If love was the foundation, why did the strategy come first? If this was about partnership, why did power always sit at the center of the conversation? And if fame was never the goal, why did every move seem designed for maximum exposure? These are uncomfortable questions, but they matter. Because this story isn't just about two people. It's about how narratives are built, how perception is curated, and how easily the public can mistake performance for authenticity when the stage is grand enough. And here's the part that still sends a chill through everyone who heard it secondhand. There was a sentence, one sentence, spoken privately, long before vows were exchanged. At the time, it sounded like confidence, like humor, like ambition. Years later, it sounds like a confession. And once you hear what that sentence was, and when it was said, it becomes impossible to unsee the truth it hinted at all along. But to understand why it mattered, we have to go back to the friendship that existed before the fairy tale ever began. Everyone loves to believe the fairy tale starts with destiny. But real stories start much earlier, in quiet rooms, private jokes, and friendships that don't make headlines. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Before the world ever saw a prince and a bride, there was a small circle of people who saw everything up close. No cameras, no scripts, no need to pretend. And that's where the first cracks appeared. At the beginning, the friendship felt genuine, supportive, almost sisterly. Late-night calls, inside humor, shared frustrations about being underestimated. There was laughter, trust, and that intoxicating feeling of being aligned with someone who gets it. Ambition bonded them. Outsider energy. A sense of we're smarter than the room. But listen closely. Ambition was always the loudest voice in the room. Early conversations weren't about love stories or futures built together. They were about access, about positioning, about what doors could open if the right people noticed at the right time. It wasn't sinister at first. It was framed as confidence, as knowing one's worth, as refusing to play small. And honestly, who questions that? But then came the comments that didn't quite land right. Little jokes that lingered too long. Observations that felt more strategic than romantic. Questions that weren't, do you love him? But do you know what this means? Would you have noticed it back then? Or would you have laughed it off too? Because when someone says something with a smile, wrapped in charm, it's easy to miss the subtext. Easy to mistake calculation for clarity. Easy to confuse ambition with affection. As the friendship deepened, so did the confidence. There was an unshakable belief that things were moving exactly as they should. Not organically, intentionally. Plans discussed casually. Outcomes assumed before they existed. as if the ending had already been written, and the only task left was execution. That's when the dynamic subtly shifted. Conversations became less mutual, less curious, more declarative. Support flowed one way. Listening turned into instructing. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the idea of partnership began to look less like two equals and more like a ladder, with one person already counting the rungs. Still, loyalty held firm. Because when you're close to someone chasing something enormous, you don't question their momentum. You don't slow them down with doubt. You convince yourself you're witnessing confidence, not entitlement. Vision, not obsession. But then came the moment that changed how everything felt. A single remark. Tossed out effortlessly. Said in private. No witnesses beyond the inner circle. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. And for the first time, it introduced a chilling possibility. That the relationship wasn't unfolding, it was being assembled. At the time, it was brushed aside. Rationalized. Forgotten. But years later, when the pieces were laid out in order, that one comment stood out like a warning no one wanted to read. Because if that statement meant what it sounded like, then love was never the foundation. It was the packaging. And the next phase of the story would prove just how much that packaging was about to be monetized. But what happened when fame finally arrived, and the mask no longer needed to be subtle, is where everything truly began to unravel. Fame didn't arrive quietly. It exploded. One moment, life was still semi-private, manageable, navigable, human. The next, everything was global. Every move mattered. Every word echoed. And that's when the shift stopped being subtle. Here's a question worth sitting with. If love is real, does attention strengthen it, or reveal what was already there? Because once the spotlight hit, the priorities sharpened fast. Conversations changed tone. Where there had once been warmth, there was now efficiency. Where there had been shared excitement, there was now expectation. Not hope, expectation. Phone calls became shorter. Replies slower. Access more controlled. And suddenly, everything had a purpose. Public appearances weren't just appearances, they were opportunities. Gestures weren't gestures, they were optics. Even vulnerability began to feel curated, strategically timed, perfectly framed for maximum impact. Have you ever watched someone stop reacting to life and start performing it? That's what those closest began to notice. Not in one dramatic moment, but in dozens of tiny ones. A calculated pause before answering questions. A rehearsed humility that disappeared the second doors closed. A fixation on numbers, coverage, reach, influence, instead of connection. The irony? The public narrative grew warmer as the private one grew colder. Smiles for cameras, distance for friends. And then came the language shift. It was no longer about we. It was about leverage, about positioning, about what could be gained, and who was still useful. Support was expected, not appreciated. Loyalty was assumed, not reciprocated. And anyone who didn't fall perfectly in line began to feel expendable. Does that sound harsh? Maybe. But patterns don't lie. The more fame grew, the smaller the inner circle became. Not because of pressure, but because of control. Information was filtered. Access was rationed. Trust became transactional. And here's where the contradiction became impossible to ignore. Publicly, the message was empowerment, independence, breaking free from old systems. Privately, everything revolved around hierarchy, influence, status, freedom for the brand, control behind the scenes. Those who raised concerns were labeled unsupportive. Those who asked questions were slowly iced out. And those who had been there before the spotlight, they watched themselves fade from relevance in real time. But the most unsettling part wasn't the distancing. It was the certainty. There was no anxiety, no doubt, no fear of losing everything, just calm assurance. As if the outcome had always been guaranteed. As if the game had already been won, and everyone else simply hadn't caught up yet. Ask yourself, where does that kind of confidence come from? Because it wasn't love that fueled it. Love is messy. Love hesitates. Love risks loss. This was different. This was someone who knew exactly what they wanted and exactly how to get it. And that's when someone finally asked the question no one had dared to voice out loud. Not to the world. Not to the press. But in a private moment, among people who still believed honesty mattered. Was this ever about the relationship? Or was the relationship just the vehicle? The answer didn't come right away. But when it did, it came in the form of a sentence so revealing so casually delivered that it erased any remaining doubt. And once that sentence was heard, there was no pretending anymore. Because the next chapter isn't about speculation. It's about intent. And what happens when intent finally slips, just for a moment, and tells the truth? What if the question was never whether the relationship would work, but how far it could be taken? Because this is the moment where everything shifts from suspicion to clarity. The room was quiet. Not tense, just still. The kind of stillness where people aren't arguing anymore because they're waiting. Waiting for honesty. Waiting for something real. Waiting for a crack in the armor. And then it happened. Not in a dramatic outburst. Not in anger. But casually. Confidently. Almost playfully. A sentence was spoken that landed differently than intended. At first, no one reacted. That's how disarming it was. It sounded like ambition. Like self-awareness. Like someone acknowledging the scale of what they were stepping into. But when the words replayed later, slowly, without charm softening the edges, they revealed something else entirely. It wasn't about love. It wasn't about partnership. It was about outcome. About elevation. About permanence. About what this union guaranteed. Have you ever heard someone say something that makes your stomach drop? Not because it's cruel, but because it's too honest? That's what this was. In that moment, the puzzle pieces that had never quite fit suddenly snapped into place. The early confidence, the certainty, the lack of fear, the transactional relationships, the obsession with visibility. The way people were discarded once they'd served their purpose. It wasn't chaos. It was control. And here's the part that still unsettles everyone who knows this story. No one confronted it. Not then. Because when someone says something that revealing, your brain rushes to protect you from what it implies. You minimize it. You reframe it. You tell yourself you misunderstood. Surely that's not what was meant, right? But time has a way of stripping away excuses. As the years passed, every major move aligned perfectly with that sentence. Media deals, strategic grievances, perfectly timed exits, carefully crafted victimhood paired with relentless self-promotion. Love became the headline. Fame became the infrastructure. Money became the insulation. And the people who had been there before? They became liabilities. Loose ends. Reminders of a version that no longer fit the brand. That's when the emotional cost finally hit. Because realizing you weren't a friend, you were a stepping stone, changes how you see everything. Every memory gets recontextualized. Every laugh feels rehearsed in hindsight. Every moment of closeness becomes suspect. Were you ever truly valued? Or were you simply early access? This is the point where silence stops being loyalty and starts becoming complicity. Where staying quiet means allowing a narrative to harden into myth, unchecked and unchallenged. And that's why this moment matters so much. Because once intent is revealed, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to believing the fairy tale without acknowledging the machinery behind it. But here's the twist. That sentence, the one that said everything without meaning to, it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more damaging. Because what came next wasn't just ambition fulfilled. It was the erasure of anyone who knew the truth. And when that erasure began, it became clear just how high the cost of fame and money truly was. Here's the part most people don't talk about. What happens after the ladder is climbed? Because ambition doesn't end at the top. It changes shape. Once the spotlight was secured, once the fame was locked in and the money no longer felt theoretical, something else began to happen. The story itself became more important than the truth. Controlling the narrative wasn't just strategic, it was survival. And that's when the erasure began. People who had been present before the cameras arrived started vanishing from the frame. Not publicly attacked, not openly rejected, just removed. Invitations stopped coming. Messages went unanswered. Histories were quietly rewritten as if certain relationships had never existed at all. Ask yourself this. If nothing was hidden, why was so much being buried? The fairy tale hardened into doctrine. Any contradiction became hostility. Any dissent became betrayal. And loyalty was no longer about trust. It was about silence. That's when the emotional weight finally broke through. Because realizing you've been written out of someone else's success story forces a brutal question. Were you ever part of their life, or just part of their climb? For the person who finally chose to speak, it wasn't revenge. It wasn't attention. It was exhaustion. The kind that comes from watching a myth solidify while knowing the blueprint behind it. From seeing ambition celebrated as authenticity. From hearing love praised when calculation had always been the engine. And here's the quiet truth that makes this so unsettling. Nothing revealed here changes the outcome. The fame still exists. The money still flows. The platform remains massive. But it changes the meaning. Because once you see how carefully the pieces were arranged, the fairy tale stops being romantic and starts being instructional. A case study in how modern power works. How perception can be engineered. How easily performance can be mistaken for sincerity when the audience wants to believe. So let's circle back to the question we started with. Was this marriage about love? Or was love the most effective language for selling ambition? Only the people inside those early rooms truly know. But patterns leave fingerprints. Timing tells stories. And sometimes, the most revealing confessions aren't shouted. They slip out quietly, long before anyone realizes they matter. And now, with distance and hindsight, those words finally make sense. The unsettling part isn't that fame and money were achieved. It's that they may have been the goal all along. So I'll leave you with this. If the outcome was always the destination, does the journey still count as real? Or was it just the most convincing performance of all? And if more voices from that inner circle decide to speak next, how much of the story we've been told will survive? So what happens after the curtain is pulled back? Because here's the uncomfortable part no one prepares you for. Once you see the machinery behind a myth, you can't enjoy the spectacle the same way again. The applause sounds different. The tears feel rehearsed. The speech is hit with a hollow echo. And that's where this story leaves us. Not with outrage, but with clarity. For the person who finally spoke up, the cost wasn't just public scrutiny. It was personal reckoning, admitting that years of loyalty may have been misplaced, that moments once believed to be genuine now carried an aftertaste of calculation, that being close didn't always mean being valued. That kind of realization doesn't come with fireworks. It comes in silence, in rewatching old conversations in your head, in noticing how every big milestone somehow benefited one side far more than the other. Ask yourself something honestly. How often do we confuse confidence with character? Because ambition isn't a flaw.